The Star Wars galaxy has some of the most awesome ships in any sci-fi universe, from Han Solo's legendary Millennium Falcon and Boba Fett's Slave One to the iconic Imperial Star Destroyer. It's one incredible design after another. These starships have firepower, crazy aesthetics, and sheer aura. But if we look at them from an out-of-universe perspective, it's not good news, especially if we actually apply real-life physics and scientific principles. Now, before we continue, I want to stress that Star Wars is space fantasy, not hard sci-fi, so this is totally fine, and I actually prefer it this way. Everything that works in Star Wars works within the rules of that universe. Nonetheless, for the sake of discussion and a bit of fun, let's look at 6 reasons why Star Wars ship designs would make no sense in the real world. I'll also briefly compare their ship designs to other sci-fi universes like The Expanse and Battlestar Galactica, so we can see how they hold up. Let's kick off with one of the most dubious design features on Star Wars ships: their exposed bridges and cockpits. We'll start with the capital ships because these really don't make sense at all. The Star Destroyer line is one of the most obvious examples of this serious flaw because most of these ships have raised bridges and exposed deflector shield generator domes. They're basically asking their enemies to shoot at them and offering them a free target. Star Wars Uprising tells us that the Empire had about 25,000 Imperial Star Destroyers at its peak. All of them had this vulnerability. It's fair to wonder what Quat Drive Yards were thinking because they were the in-universe shipyard responsible for the design. Yes, it definitely adds to their aura, but at a heavy price. The Return of the Jedi gives us the most shocking example when Green Leader Arvel Krynard kamikaze ran his A-Wing into the Executor's bridge. The remainder of the ship was in one piece, but his bravery instantly decapitated its command and sent the massive destroyer on a doomed trajectory into the Death Star. The canon reference book, Starships and Speeders, tells us that the Executor had a crew of about 280,000 and a complement of over 1,000 ships. A single pilot was able to destroy all that in moments. One character in the Legends novel Spectre of the Past says that Imperial Star Destroyers had 174,000 flaws waiting to be exploited. However, it didn't need to be this way because they actually solved some of their biggest issues without realizing it. Many people don't realize it, but the standard ISD-2 actually had 2 command centers, not 1. As well as the primary bridge, there was also an internal backup command center within the depths of the ship. This would take over if the primary bridge suffered critical damage or was cut off from communications. The big question here is why not put the ship's command in this safer area instead of exposing them to the enemy? The Essential Guide to Ships and Vehicles says that the proximity of the deflector shield generators made the raised bridge one of the most protected areas on the ship. That's all fine except for 2 big issues. First, the enemy is naturally going to concentrate their firepower on the bridge and other critical external zones of the ship. Secondly, if the shields go down, the bridge will be the obvious next target. Star Destroyers aren't the only capital ships with this serious flaw, but they're the most iconic ones. Proto-destroyers like the Clone Wars era Acclamator class cruiser, all the way to the ridiculous First Order Mandator 4-star Dreadnought had similar design features. It is worth noting that the First Order did make some effort to address this clear issue with the Resurgent class Star Destroyer, as well as the Mega class. Neither of these ship designs has raised bridges, but they still retain their intimidating vistas. Indeed, for all of the sequel trilogy's issues, I stand by the fact that the Resurgent Star Destroyer is still one of Star Wars' coolest ship designs, and a natural in-universe replacement for the classic ISD. The lightsaber, an elegant weapon for a more civilized age. And while General Grievous may have collected them for less civilized reasons, you've got to admit there's just something about them. If you're anything like me, you've probably imagined what it would be like to hold one yourself. That's actually why I started Stickman Sabers. The goal was simple: make lightsabers that look amazing, being literally one-to-one replicas of the ones seen on screen, but are also built to handle real use, so you can duel without stressing about damaging them every time things get intense. They are all equipped with state-of-the-art pixel technology, giving off an incredibly bright light that will light up the darkest rooms out there, and obviously have the iconic hum that just feels right the moment you switch it on. And for a limited time, if you pick one up, you'll also get 2 combat sabers for free. If you've ever thought about starting your own collection, this is a pretty good place to start.
Links in the description, and now let's get back to the video.
Another issue related to command bridges in general across Star Wars ships is their wide use of transparasteel. There's not a whole lot of exposition about the makeup of transparasteel, but basically it's a metal alloy that's primarily used to make starship windows. Jedi Fallen Order makes it clear that it's extremely tough, which is why Darth Vader's helmet eye sockets also incorporate it. But in canon and legends, it's much weaker than durasteel. Star Wars Galactic Defense explains that durasteel is stronger than regular steel and could even briefly withstand lightsaber blows. There were other even stronger materials. Quadonium, which was even stronger and lighter than durasteel, featured in the Death Star and the Executor. Meanwhile, in Legends, shipbuilders sometimes use neutronium for reactor housings and extreme load components because of its exceptional density. The Revenge of the Sith Incredible Cross-Sections also mentions that Clone Wars-era ships incorporated agrinium due to its defensive properties. Anyway, the point is that there are plenty of in-universe alloys and metals that do the job much better than transparasteel, so why use it? The easy answer is that they need windows so they can see, but this is almost completely unnecessary, at least on the scale these ships include. Almost every ship in Star Wars also uses sensors. They don't need to look out these huge windows and see what's out there because it's pretty obvious. They're in space. Using sensors is a much safer and more efficient way of analyzing surroundings before reacting to them. In the real world, ships may also have cameras situated around them. It's entirely reasonable to want to see the physical condition of a ship or what's outside if something forces the pilot to make a landing in a potentially dangerous situation like Han Solo in The Empire Strikes Back. But huge windows aren't necessary because they just create a vulnerability that goes against every bit of real-life spaceship design doctrine. Another solution would have been the in-universe hologram technology that would give a 3D rendition of the ship and its surroundings. There's no consistency with this either across different Star Wars ships. The A-Wing is almost like a floating bubble with its huge cockpit canopy, while the TIE Fighter only has forward visibility because of its side panels. Even the Millennium Falcon is blind on one side, which doesn't help it in battle at all. However, I will caveat this, that it's basically a glorified truck that Han and Chewbacca modify internally beyond recognition. The Lambda-class shuttle is also ridiculous if you think about it too much, because it has a massive cockpit. Remember, its primary role is for VIP transport, so why put them in extra harm's way? All it would take is one stray bit of space debris and they'd be bantha fodder. It's worth noting that a few ships in the canon Star Wars galaxy didn't have transparasteel, including the Republic's Acclamator-class cruiser. In the Legends Dark Empire comic book series, Boba Fett upgrades his Firespray-class patrol ship Slave 1 for Slave 2, a Mandal Motors Pursuer-class enforcement ship. Slave 2 had barely any transparasteel compared to its predecessor, so on paper it's much safer. There's still some, but it's barely visible compared to his most iconic ship. Windows do exist on real-life ships like the space shuttles and NASA's Orion for several reasons. They're important for docking maneuvers and observation, as well as helping crew mental health, because if you can look outside, it feels less like you're inside a floating coffin. But they're nowhere near as big as the massive observation decks on Star Wars capital ships. Usually they're tiny to reduce structural weaknesses and radiation exposure. According to Space.com, the International Space Station has 7 windows in the cupola model, which provide 360-degree views of the Earth and the surrounding solar system. But each window is basically a glorified porthole and has a retractable cover to protect against dangerous space debris and intense solar exposure. One of the most exciting aspects of every Star Wars movie and game is the epic space battles. However, I'm about to rain on their parade by saying that they don't make any sense if we apply real-life principles to them. Again, let me make it clear that I don't have any problem with this. Star Wars is space fantasy and I love it, but it's also interesting to compare what we see on the silver screen to what would actually go down in real life. Starfighters play a massive role in Star Wars space battles and remain some of the most beloved ships in the galaxy. George Lucas has freely admitted that World War II dogfights, including the Battle of Midway, inspired many of the scenes in the movies, especially involving X-Wing pilots. However, there are some reasons why these ships and their maneuvers wouldn't work in the real world. Remember, there's no gravity in space, so ships could theoretically move in any direction they want with total freedom. Yet they still mimic the patterns of fighter jets, only flying forward. There's no reason why X-Wings or Z-95 headhunters would need wings in reality, beyond an aesthetic choice. If anything, they create a vulnerability because they're relatively slender and susceptible to damage, which is a completely unnecessary risk. Another aspect is that pilots survive G-forces that would kill them in the real world. Anybody who's watched Top Gun Maverick or Brad Pitt's Formula 1 movie will see the strain that high speeds put on the human body. In reality, people will often pass out at 4 to 5 Gs. Some roller coasters can reach this speed, so imagine what being an A-Wing or TIE Interceptor would do to a regular human body. We can make an in-universe allowance for human Jedi like Anakin and Luke Skywalker because of their exceptional gifts, but there's no physical reason why Han Solo should be able to survive such high speeds in the Millennium Falcon. The Expanse TV series offers one of the most realistic depictions of high-speed space travel because it acknowledges the stress this would put on the human body. The crew of the Rocinante receives a specialized drug cocktail injection that enables them to survive high G-forces. This is something that the Star Wars universe simply doesn't acknowledge. Pod racing is the closest they come to admitting it's an issue. In The Phantom Menace, Anakin proudly says that he's the only human who can do it. This may be an exaggeration, but he's certainly the only human to win a major race. However, the reality is that as fast as starfighters are, they're not actually fast enough. This might seem crazy, but according to NASA, the Apollo 10 spacecraft reached speeds of 24,791 miles per hour. That was in the real world in 1969. It would almost be impossible for a sentient pilot to lock onto a target at these insane speeds. Meanwhile, as Douglas Adams was fond of saying, space is massive, so there's almost no chance of these small shops being able to target each other. Actually, I question why they bother using living pilots at all, because it seems like AI systems or droids would have a far quicker processing time. Now, the Star Wars galaxy has long had a deep mistrust of droids, as we know from the moment that R2-D2 and C-3PO entered the Mos Eisley Cantina, but it's heavily implied that there was some kind of massive disaster involving droids and AI way back in ancient times, even before the Rakatan Infinite Empire. A droid war also provoked the destruction of the Yuuzhan Vong's planet in Legends and their journey to the regular Star Wars galaxy. Han made it a point of refusing to put the Millennium Falcon under slave systems in the Solo movie novelization and A.C. Crispin's Han Solo trilogy. Another in-universe reason for not using AI or robots is that droids lack the creativity and adaptability of humans. This is totally acceptable and a fair reason for why you might not want a droid to fly your starship. But what about using droids or AI to fire weapons? This makes more sense than using a farm boy who's literally never been on a spacecraft before as a gunner. That's exactly what Han does with Luke in Episode 4 as they skirmish with some TIE fighters. Also, it's more likely that real space conflict would use satellites for precision attacks and rapid calculations. There's nothing as cinematic as a squadron of X-Wing pilots racing to their starfighters before locking their S-foils in attack position and engaging the enemy. It's incredibly entertaining, but it wouldn't happen in the real world. But don't just take it from me, let's hear what some actual respected scientists have to say. Dr. Rebecca Reisman and James R. Wilson from the Aerospace Corporation Center for Space Policy and Strategy wrote a fascinating paper on the topic of space battles. It's entitled "The Physics of Space War: How Orbital Dynamics Constrain Space-to-Space Engagements," and it's really worth checking out if you're a true space battle nerd. In the article, they state, space-to-space engagements would be deliberate and likely unfold slowly because space is big, and spacecraft can escape their predictable paths only with great effort. Furthermore, attacks on space assets would require precision because spacecraft and even ground-based weapons can engage targets in space only after complex calculations are determined in a highly engineered domain. This is pretty much the opposite of what happens in Star Wars battles. Of course, we can totally discount this by saying the physics and science in the Star Wars galaxy mean they can overcome these complex issues. However, if we go back to The Expanse again, we see an example of how space combat probably would work with ships firing nuclear missiles at each other from extreme range. We've focused on starfighters so far, but what about capital ships? The opening scene of Revenge of the Sith is one of the most epic in the entire trilogy, as laser bolts and explosions light up space above Coruscant. It seems like these gigantic ships are brimming with weaponry as starfighters zip and zoom around them. However, a closer look at them shows that the majority of these huge vessels have massive blind spots. So many ships in Star Wars have no ventral or underbelly coverage. The Star Destroyer is especially prone to this. The Revenge of the Sith incredible cross-section shows us that hangars dominate the ventral sections of the Venator-class Star Destroyer. Its silhouette is slightly less exposed than that of later Star Destroyers like the ISD or Super Star Destroyers. These ships have practically no weaponry beneath their hulls, so when someone attacks from below, they just eat fire. They have an over-dependence on their escort ships and starfighter squadrons to defend them. To be fair, I can give a canon in-universe reason for this. The Empire didn't care about casualties and was more about presenting an aura of invincibility. Just getting an ISD to show up in a resistant system was usually enough to nip it in the bud. But even the heavily militarized First Order falls victim to this key design flaw. The Mandator 4 Star Dreadnought in The Last Jedi is literally destroyed by bombers attacking from beneath. It's frankly insane that there's almost no turbo laser coverage down there, but that's Star Destroyer logic. Even the next generation Resurgent class still doesn't protect its ventral areas. It's worth noting that some ships actually do have ventral cannons or missiles like the Millennium Falcon, Slave 1, and Arc 170 starfighters, but it's remarkable how few adapt this extremely useful weapon because it makes so much sense. Another problematic aspect of Star Wars ship design is the heavy emphasis on ideological designs. In the real world, there's no place for aesthetics in spacecraft production. Everything is about functionality, and if it doesn't improve the design, it has no place being on a ship. I've already talked about their massive windows, but let's talk about their general aesthetic choices, starting with Naboo's ships. Padme Amidala's J-12 Nubian starship is the epitome of Naboo's ship design. Darth Sidious, of all people, gives a perfect description of it in the Darth Vader comic book series, calling it the royal vessel of the lovely Padme Amidala. Such an elegant ship from an elegant world. Even an evil Dark Lord of the Sith recognized style when he saw it. The Ultimate Star Wars reference book described how the people of Naboo consider this ship to be a work of art and symbolized the designer's desire to create a symbol of grace and beauty. Perhaps even more iconic is the N-1 Starfighter, a sleek twin-engine patrol ship that served as the backbone of Naboo's planetary defense. Of course, Din Djarin also used a modified N-1 as a replacement for his ST-70 assault craft, the Razor Crest. These ships immediately create an image for us of Naboo as a culture, and we understand what values they prioritize. That's the great success of the Star Wars universe as a fantasy world, and one of the many reasons why we all love it. But, yes, you knew there was a but coming, these ships would never work in real life using the materials we have available to us, because they'd be too dangerous and vulnerable. Of course, this doesn't matter, so don't think I'm hating on Star Wars because I'm not. To focus on this while we immerse ourselves in this fictional galaxy would be to totally miss the point. Nonetheless, let's look at some other Star Wars factions for comparison. The Galactic Empire and First Order are two closely related regimes with similar ships and values. George Lucas wanted viewers to know that the Imperials were the bad guys from the opening scenes of Episode 4. That first shot of an Imperial Star Destroyer looming across the screen in pursuit of the Tantive 4 is one of the most iconic in cinema history. The success of the ISD inspired dozens of other Star Destroyers in canon and legends, but they all retain that dagger-like wedge aesthetic because it has such an ominous aura. In real life, NASA and SpaceX's ships have very conventional cone and rocket shapes because these are the most functional and efficient. There's simply no room for creativity because real space travel is already so dangerous for the crews on board. Mon Calamari battlecruisers are arguably the most realistic Star Wars ships, although the bar isn't very high here. In Timothy Zahn's second Thrawn trilogy novel, Dark Force Rising, Princess Leia describes how Mon Calamari's wonderful star cruisers were once passenger liners. This is an element of Legends that carried over to canon and explains why they're more practical than some of their counterparts. These ships had a very nebulous design, which is less aesthetically striking than many other ships in Star Wars. However, they do somewhat evoke ocean whales, and their flowing lines are probably appealing to the Mon Calamari as a species. However, I think they're more realistic because the bridge is deeper inside than the ship. The Rogue One visual guide explains how they also have very strong armor and powerful shields, which reflect their backgrounds as city and passenger ships. These ships do a great job of conveying how the Rebel Alliance doesn't care what something looks like as long as it does the job for them. This is more in line with real-life spaceship doctrine. Another key flaw with Star Wars spaceships is that so many of them experience a single critical failure. Now, before I continue with this, I want to acknowledge that yes, there have been many space disasters in real life. The Challenger and Columbia space shuttle disasters came at the cost of 14 lives, while the 1967 Apollo cabin fire resulted in 3 astronauts dying. However, there are some big differences between these critical failures and their equivalents in Star Wars. First, the obvious one is that space travel has been around for literally thousands of years in George Lucas's universe. In Star Wars Build the Millennium Falcon, we learned that the Rakatan Empire was the first to pursue hyperspace travel. Legends tell us that their empire existed over 36,000 BBY, so it's fair to assume that sublight travel was around for even longer than this. Meanwhile, humanity has only been venturing into space from Earth since 1961, when Yuri Gagarin completed a single orbit in the Vostok 1. In short, Star Wars has had a lot of time to get things right, and to make sure that its ships don't have a single flaw that can result in catastrophic consequences. I've already talked about how dumb the Star Destroyer bridge designs are, but let's touch on that again. Remember how a single A-Wing took down the Executor, the biggest ship in the galaxy, at the Battle of Endor? Surely someone from Quat Drive Yards could have looked at the schematics and come up with a better solution. Of course, I know that this is also a plot device. The Empire and later the First Order have all of these massive, terrifying ships with overwhelming firepower, but the plucky rebels always find a way to outsmart them. It's like when the bombers take out the Mandator IV during the opening of The Last Jedi. The First Order ship exposes its weak point to Poe Dameron and Paige Tico, sealing its fate. Meanwhile, in almost every Star Wars movie, you'll see a Star Destroyer getting its bridge wiped out and suffering an all-too-easy destruction. However, the most notorious example is the destruction of the first Death Star. I know they're technically space stations, but they have hyperdrives and engines, so for this video I'm putting them in the same category as starships. If you watched any Star Wars movie before 2016, you would likely think that the Empire was incredibly dumb to include a single critical vulnerability in their most powerful battle station. Firing a photon torpedo into one thermal exhaust port would create a chain reaction that would blow up the entire Death Star and between 1.5 and 2.3 million people, depending on your source. It seems like a shocking lack of foresight, even if the target was only as wide as a womp rat on Tatooine. Rogue One, a Star Wars story, somewhat improves this shocking plot hole by explaining that Galen Erso deliberately included the weakness as his last act of revenge against the Empire. This definitely makes it less ridiculous, but I still think there could have been someone looking over his shoulder to make sure he wasn't up to anything nefarious, because he obviously wasn't happy with his day job. Nonetheless, if we accept that Erso committed an act of sabotage that nobody could have predicted, and that Luke Skywalker was almost the only person in the galaxy capable of that single shot, it's not so dumb. But the destruction of the second Death Star was arguably even dumber from an Imperial perspective. Firstly, this was all Emperor Palpatine's fault, because he used the unfinished Death Star as bait for Luke Skywalker and the Rebel Alliance fleet. This Death Star depended on a ground shield installation on Endor's moon to protect it. The DS-2 had an exposed core because the Empire hadn't finished constructing it, so it was crucial to protect the shield generator. One of the first potential plot holes is why didn't the rebels just target the generator from space or use a squadron of bombers to take it out? The short answer to this is that the generator actually protected itself through the shield it was emitting, so destroying it required boots on the ground. So why didn't the Empire put one of its most lethal Special Forces divisions in front of it? Again, because the Emperor didn't want to, and believed that the shield generator had to be an attainable target for the rebels to commit to attacking it. We know from Episode 6 that he was desperate to get Luke on board the Death Star to lure him to the dark side. Imperial hubris also didn't factor in a bunch of teddy bears being able to destroy their AT-STs with Gorax traps. After the shield came down, the DS-2 was immediately vulnerable to rebel attacks because of its exposed core. Everybody watching this knows exactly what happened next. Let me wrap up this section by briefly talking about Starkiller Base. It's not a spacecraft, but the actual hollowed out planet Elam, where Jedi used to go to get kyber crystals for the lightsabers. The Rise of Skywalker Visual Dictionary explains that Elam has a crystalline core, which the First Order used to power their most dastardly weapon. Starkiller Base was too big to move, even by Star Wars standards. However, it did have the unique ability to fire its weapon through hyperspace. The big problem with Starkiller Base was its oscillator, which converted a star's energy into planet-destroying energy shots. The Resistance discovered that if the oscillator overheated, the entire base would destabilize and potentially self-destruct. Long story short, that's exactly what happens in the movie after a few X-Wings and a sabotage team blow it to smithereens. I don't know about you, but I'm seeing a pattern here. These designs make no sense, because even if the Empire and First Order can't remove the structural weaknesses, they should be putting as much protection around them as possible. It's time to move on to the last problem I have with Star Wars spacecraft design, and that is that starcrafts are basically like Lego. What I mean by this is that nobody seems to have a problem finding interchangeable parts for their ships or repairing them, no matter where they are in the galaxy. The Millennium Falcon is the classic example because Han Solo practically held the ship together with duct tape. It's a running joke throughout the series and part of why we love the Falcon so much. Most of Chewbacca's screen time is him trying to keep the ship airborne. Amazingly, they managed to achieve this in almost every environment, including from inside a literal space slug in Episode 5. At one point in the movie, Han manages to magically fix the Falcon's latest woe by bypassing the compressor. There's nothing like a bit of techno-babble to justify fixing a dubious decision in a sci-fi movie, but let's consider what they actually mean. Compressors are load-bearing systems, so this would actually reduce capacity and increase stress, negatively impacting performance. In real life, a single anomaly would result in NASA aborting the mission because it's just too risky. Meanwhile, in The Force Awakens, Han reclaims the Falcon from Jakku, where it has been sitting dormant in a junkyard for years. We get a great emotional line when he says, "Chewie, we're home." Then they power it up and take off without any issues. This is the Falcon we're talking about, one of the most volatile ships in the galaxy. Let's take another example of dubious starship repairs, but look at it from the opposite perspective. In The Phantom Menace, Queen Amidala's ship makes an emergency landing on Tatooine after its hyperdrive fails. They specifically needed a T-14 hyperdrive that was compatible with most Nubian ships. Somehow, the only place on the planet where they could get one was a random Toydarian's junkyard. He also just happens to be the owner of a slave who happens to be the chosen one. Sometimes it's better to suspend belief and not to think about things too much, because even if we accept that the Force brought Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan to this location, it's still not the most likely scenario. Meanwhile, astromech droids act like get-out-of-jail-free cards. R2-D2 is the real MVP of the Star Wars galaxy because he does everything, from repairing Queen Amidala's ship under fire to fixing up Luke Skywalker's X-Wing. Astromechs do make sense from one perspective because they run data and compute much faster than sentient pilots. So that aspect is actually fine. But the bit that's difficult to accept is how much work they get through. R2-D2 is also the ultimate MacGuffin because he carries the original stolen Death Star plans. It's also worth noting that the only time ships are under pressure to refuel is in The Last Jedi. Resistance ships attempt to flee from the First Order at sublight speeds while running out of fuel, like in a World War II submarine chase. This is a polarizing sequence because, let's face it, everything in the sequel trilogy is controversial, but it also does somewhat resemble what would happen in real life. However, the big problem with this is the lack of backup fuel ships. It's worth noting, though, that the Rebellion considers some logistics, as we see with the presence of medical frigates at the Battle of Endor. In the eras we're most familiar with, most Star Wars ships have hyperdrives, with some exceptions like TIE fighters. However, in the early days of the Republic, travelers depended on hyperdrive beacons for safe travel. According to Star Wars: Battles That Changed the Galaxy, these were essentially small stations that also operated as refueling points. This proves that it was an issue for ships, but one that doesn't seem to occur very often. This is consistent throughout the Star Wars universe because ships seem to run forever. Again, it's worth comparing them to hard sci-fi that's trying to feel real, like The Expanse or Battlestar Galactica. In these universes, there are potentially lethal consequences if you run out of fuel, water, or other key resources. Star Wars is a space fantasy, so it transcends these real-world considerations. This gives it the freedom to focus on mesmerizing visuals and creating a mythos that we all adore. It doesn't matter if every ship has perfect Earth levels of gravity, because that's not what we care about.
Oh, and again, for a limited time, every Stickman Saber purchase comes with 2 additional combat sabers, so you're more than ready for your own duels. If that sounds like something you'd want to look into, the link's in the description.